Hey friends, welcome back to Immeasurably More, podcast by Victory Hill. My name is Noelle Tomko. I'm your host as always. We are going to have a conversation today I'm very excited about. It's been a conversation I feel really ever since entering the church and coming to know who Christ was and what his love means and what it does. I have felt burdened to have this sort of conversation because unfortunately I just think it's something that the church as a whole has sort of moved away from. If you have daughters, if you have friends, if you are a married woman, a married man, a single person, I think that you'll find great value in this conversation. It's one that myself and the guest have come into agreement on that we feel is hugely important to break down. Today we'll do that in a shorter version, but I hope it's the first of maybe a few conversations that we can have. So Madelyn Fuehne is here with me today. Madelyn is the producer of our podcast, and she's also married to Michael, who is our youth pastor. Together they lead some of our young adult activities and our youth here at the church. And I'm just thankful that you're willing to have this conversation with me. I know the first time that we even kind of mentioned the word purity, it was like we both, even though our lives were completely different growing up and we had two entirely different messaging systems, we came into agreement like right. There's kind of a problem here that I think needs to be talked about.
Absolutely.
So I want to kind of dig into what was your upbringing like and really what were the words that you were hearing when it came to purity. And just, you know, for the audience's purpose, I do want to say before we start that I wholeheartedly believe in the message that God's design for us physically speaking is to, you know, be abstinent until marriage. But today we want to talk about how this idea of purity expands so much farther than just the physical, and that if things aren't set up right internally, we're not going to behave correctly externally.
Right.
And how do we become that pure of spirit? I think it's something that we continually have to chase throughout our walk with the Lord. But I want people to understand that I am by no means suggesting that physical purity is not important,
right?
Because it is. We know the dangers of taking sex outside of the confines of marriage. I know that firsthand. You know, I was a single mother before my husband and I got married. So as long as we know from the jump that I stand firm on what the Bible teaches about sexual immorality, and I agree with that, but I also believe in a redeeming God. And so I want to be able to touch on both of those things. So Madelyn, tell me a little bit about sort of how you grew up. I know you grew up in the church. You were very fortunate to have a family that was a priority. So walk me through that.
Yeah. I grew up in the church my whole life. You know, one of those things, you're a church kid, you just kind of have that expectation of moral integrity.
Was your father a pastor?
My father was not a pastor. He was an elder though.
Got it.
Taught Sunday school.
Yes.
Mom
I knew
taught
he did
Sunday
something
school.
in the church.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was similar to a pastor kid. You know, we were in the church every time the doors were open, like he might as well have been. We grew up in a small country church. So it kind of was that role of, hey, I'll do whatever I can to kind of move this along. He was retired military. So we had, mom was stay-at-home mom. So like we had a little bit extra time on our hands, to say the least, just to pour into the kingdom. And so it was a very involved church. We had a small youth group, very different than some that I've participated in since then. And the one that we have now here at this church, we had about 10 kids. And I'll never forget, you know, we sat down and we had the purity conversation one Sunday. Pastor talked about it from the pulpit. And, you know, just listening to it, it clicked in my head for the first time, I think, of, okay, what does this mean besides just like from a physical standpoint? Because we do, you know, you emphasize the importance of, yes, it's meant for the covenant of marriage. And I think a lot of the times churches get, I mean, let's just say it boldly, sex. We talk about sex in a light that brings negativity.
Right.
Makes it dirty.
Right.
Like it's a dirty
But
sin.
then the moment we get married, we're supposed to hit this switch where it's this loving thing.
Right. And it's like, how can you talk about something so dirty that's meant for such a pure covenant, a covenant so much so that's pure? I mean, Christ is our groom and he's coming back for the church. And it's like, we're referencing an analogy that we can't bring. I mean, you can't.
Right.
It's
that
not
the creator of it can't be spoken of.
Right. Yeah, and so it's like we're talking about sex in this light of like, oh, if you do it, you're like condemned. And I want to preface this whole conversation with John 3. We all know John 3:16, but John 3:17, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but rather so that the world might be saved
through him. Yeah.
Right. And so we can't talk about sex and the condemning side of things. And so I remember sitting and just listening to the sermon, and I kind of heard it from that perspective, but he also brought it around from that. And so I was like, okay, well, we need to have a further conversation about this, because I'm in a spot, middle school, high school age, where it's like, okay, we're not we're starting to kind of go through puberty. We're starting to have thoughts, right? Yeah. So what do we do with those thoughts?
And hearing conversations
right.
that you've maybe
back
not
of the
heard.
bus. Yeah. Back of the bus is where you learn all of the knowledge if you go to public school. And so it's like we need to start.
Buses are dangerous.
They're very dangerous. But we need to start having a healthy conversation of what this means. And so I approached my youth pastor and I was like, hey, like, I really want to have a conversation about purity and what that looks like. And he did such a good job about looking into resources. And he found a study that looked at it not just from the physical standpoint, but from a heart standpoint,
right?
Because it is a heart standpoint. I was looking at the definition of purity before recording today, and a lot of the definitions I found, it is the condition or quality of being pure, meaning it's a freedom from anything that debases. And so, like, you think of like water purification, they're not filtering out just one thing; they're filtering out all of the impurities. And so, when we think about purity, oftentimes the Christian brain goes immediately to, oh, well, I can't have sex out of marriage.
Right.
I'm like, yes, that's important. But when we're talking about purity, we're talking about our thoughts. We're talking about our heart, because our heart is the wellspring from which everything else
flows.
Is. Yes. And so we have to be looking at it from a greater standpoint of God calls us to be pure in heart. What does that mean and what does it look like? Because it doesn't just mean I'm saving myself for a future marriage.
Right. Because then what happens after that?
Right.
Right. If this thing has become so big and it's become really the sole target, what does that mean once you've hit that target?
Absolutely.
Then what?
Right.
What happens if your spouse dies? What happens if you go through a divorce? What happens when there's infidelity? Does that just mean now that not only you were defiled, but your marriage was defiled and that there's no restoration from that?
Exactly.
You know, the purity, as you were saying, from the heart, you know, I believe that's why when we talk about the heart, and we've had, you know, a few episodes back where we talked about just the different conditions of the heart. When you are, the closer you are to Christ, the more pure you become.
Right.
Your thoughts become more pure. Your ways become more pure.
Yes.
So what is that teaching to a generation of both females and males to concentrate solely on this physical thing? Because unfortunately, and it happens in the church frequently, which is sad to say, you have people who did not have a choice in having, it was taken from them.
Right.
It was stolen from them. And so if all you're doing is putting the importance on, you need to be pure for your husband, which by the way, I do find it funny that most of the conversations are geared towards females.
Yes.
It seems a little unbalanced.
Yeah.
But if you're constantly telling someone that you're defiled, you're impure, you have no gift to give your husband on your wedding night.
Yeah.
But that's something that was stolen from them as a child. You've given them a life of hopelessness. They've got nothing to strive for. They have nothing to hope for. Why would they turn to a savior if we, as his representation, are telling them that it's a done deal?
Right.
It's a dangerous area to be in. It's a slippery slope when we start coming from a place of shame rather than a place of value.
Absolutely.
And I'm encouraged that you had the ability and the relationship with church leadership to say, we really need to have this conversation.
Right.
You know, there are 10 of us, but 10 of us are going to become 20 of us. And then we're going to have children, and that's going to grow to 40 and 50. And what you're going to learn at that age is going to stick with you forever. When you and I first started talking about this topic, you said something to me that really shook me in a good way, but it stopped me for a moment. I had never considered purity this way, but you said that growing up in the church and hearing so much about purity culture, especially in the generation that you did, where we were coming out of a season of all of these books that were written and it really being shoved down the throats of young girls again. You said it becomes an idol. That saving yourself for marriage becomes this pedestaled idol. That you're no longer preparing for marriage. You're no longer preparing for an education. You're no longer preparing to be a homemaker if you choose, or a mother if you choose. Your sole focus has become on idolizing purity. And then again, you get married and you have your wedding night. Then what? Does that now mean this horrible, dirty thing that I couldn't have before has now entered my marriage? Well, no, it's not saying that. Oh, okay, well then what is it saying? The conversation stops after you get married.
It sure does.
It's like the whole goal is to rally you to get to your wedding night, and then you look around and everyone's disappeared. You know, it's so having this talk with our children, I think from a young age and continually.
Yes.
You know, sex doesn't have to be a scary conversation.
Not at all.
Especially if you're allowing the Lord to lead it. You know, it can be a very beautiful conversation. and in a way that you're able to speak about the bond that God wants between a man and a woman to become one flesh. If you're telling them it's because he wants you to no longer be two individual people living, he wants you to be one. So he gives you this gift to become one with that person. Well, you don't want to do that with 5 or 50 or 2,000 people.
Exactly.
You just, that's a lot to work back from. And when I say work, I mean the inner work, the processing and the healing and the undoing of all those dangers that one might have when they come into a relationship with Christ.
Right.
So you guys have this purity conversation. You felt he did a wonderful job explaining it.
Absolutely.
From a heart place, which is huge. I know you and I had talked about, we'd heard a story of an individual who went through a purity conversation, a group of females with a male pastor, young females, and he had on the stage 2 roses. One that was cut fresh and beautiful, and another one that was wilted and dead.
Yeah.
And he said to the crowd, if you have sex outside of marriage, and lifts the dead wilted rose and says, this is what you're giving your husband, it's useless.
Right.
But if you've saved yourself, then you're essentially beautiful.
Right.
Well, you can't say, I understand. I can understand from an outside perspective that what he thought he was teaching was,
right.
I mean, groundbreaking information. Give them the visual. I mean, do all the right things.
It's going to stick with them. That's for sure.
But then the girls who were sitting there are like, well, that rose is never coming back to life.
Yeah.
So there's no hope for me.
Right.
There's nothing. And it's like I said before, it's dangerous territory to be in, to tell people that we're supposed to serve a God who can take away all sin.
Except this one.
Right. And then to not have the scriptural backing to back up that thought.
Right. Absolutely. Right. And that's why I wanted to start this conversation with God didn't come to condemn this world. And so I think, and it is a hard conversation to broach. And I think some youth pastors get it really, really right. I would like to just put that out there that mine did. I mean, he did the research, he did the back. And I'm not saying that the people who do those analogies aren't doing it right. If that's what they feel God has called them to say, like, I'm not going to tell you that you're doing anything wrong. But I do think that there's a very damning appearance to it of, if you're going to look at me and say that I can no longer be restored because of Christ to what he has called me to, like, sure, don't get me wrong, I've given a piece of myself away that I can never attain back.
Right.
But that does not mean that I'm no longer worthy of the love of a future husband, or I can't give a gift to him. You know, it's like one of those things of, you're essentially telling me that I am damaged goods.
That's right.
And I know, so like my youth pastor did a great job of that. I was one of those girls who put purity on a pedestal. It did become an idol in my life. You know, I signed a contract, we got the purity ring, we did all of the things. And I think that there's great benefit in that.
Sure. I agree with you. Yeah.
But when it becomes an identity in your life of, I was the one preaching to my friends that you can't have sex before marriage, but that was the conversation. I didn't have that emphasis on the heart posture or anything. And so when I entered college, it's a very different world when you're hearing the concept of purity
in the safety of your small church where you know everyone.
Right. And then you go and you experience life for the first time and you get a taste of freedom. And God saved me from a lot. I could have gone down a lot of darker roads. And so he really did spare me in a lot of ways. And I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah.
But it was almost comical that he took me from a place of, you're going to be preaching to your friends and your peers about purity. And then I'm going to take you down a road where I'm going to walk you through a situation or temptations. And I did fail some of those. And then to sit, I was volunteering for a church before we came here, and I love the youth pastor, and I don't ever want anybody to think anything different. But he gave the analogy of 2 Barbies in a fire, and it's like, if you move closer to the fire and like the Barbie's burned, right? And so it was
I don't mean to laugh because it's not funny, but
right.
I have so many questions.
Right.
Like, did they have clothes on?
No.
Okay.
No.
They were naked.
So it was supposed to be like a analogy of sex, and it's like,
were they 2 females?
No.
Okay.
It was a male and a female.
Okay. I was going to say, because that poses a whole different set of questions. It does pose a whole different question.
Yes. But no, it was a male and a female. And so he was using the analogy of these Barbies, and I got the analogy. I understood it. It made sense. It's going to stick in my brain. It's going to stick in the kids' brains, right? That's not the only thing that we should be looking at. I mean, because we're talking about, if we have a fireplace, yes, and the fire's kept in the fireplace, and that's our identity of marriage. Like, it's in that structure. Right. Yeah. It's safe. The closer you move to that, you're going to get burned.
Right.
a good analogy, but
Yeah.
sitting where I was as a volunteer who had walked down a path
Where you had been closer to the fire than
where
you
I
wanted
had
to
been
be.
closer to
Yeah.
the fire than I wanted to be and had let myself go further than I wanted to. I felt shame and guilt sitting there.
Sure.
And I can only imagine, I've been around long enough to understand that I can be restored through Christ Jesus.
Right. Thank God.
Right. And that he offers no condemnation, but only love. And that I still have access. How damning for those little girls who are sitting there,
Right.
high school age girls who maybe have done something.
Right.
Because it is pushed in this society that sex is an idol. It's in all of our shows. It's in all of our movies. It's in our music. It's everywhere.
Isn't it interesting that it is sold as this high commodity item, but it's also, you're supposed to look at it and go, well, it means nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, the contradiction within that.
Yeah.
It means nothing. I had a conversation with, right before I met my husband and we got married, I was working out at this gym and I had, become, I'll use the word friend, but they weren't people that I spent time with outside of. I would just see them. And there was a conversation that I walked upon one day. Now, mind you, at this time in my job, I was teaching abstinence education in public and private schools, middle school and high school.
Yeah.
And I adored that job. And I think the work is so unbelievably important because you're able to get there and talk with these students from an honest place about all their options and that they are going to have the freedom to pick from all of these options. You weren't just coming in with this one angle trying to sell them on something.
Right.
You were just like, look, you're a human being. You can do A, B, and C. And here's the risks that come with A, B, and C. And you're going to choose, but you got to feel empowered by the information you have. And so I loved my job and I loved the information. And of course I had all of these stats and I had all this stuff from the CDC and I had all this information to arm myself to be, to argue a point, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And I think so many times we get prepared to argue our side when that's not how we win people over.
Absolutely not.
I mean, ever. You can have all the information in the world. That doesn't mean that you are ever going to introduce somebody to the Jesus you say you serve.
Right.
And I walked into this conversation of these 20s, mid to late 20s. Nobody in this group had ever been married, had ever had children. And I heard the term third base. And I stopped and I thought, wait, what are they talking about?
Right.
And it was male, female, mixed conversation. And the one girl said, well, yeah, I mean, third base is dinner. And I was like, third base is dinner? I'm like, don't you mean first base? And she was like, no. And this whole group was in agreement that if you don't have sexual compatibility with somebody, they're not even worth a text back, let alone an actual date.
Wow.
And I thought how far we've fallen as a society, that we give ourselves away before this person even knows our last name, our favorite color,
Right.
what moves us, and to see this group of women devalue themselves with what they were saying and not even knowing.
Yeah.
And not even knowing. And how do you teach somebody the value in the moment? I'm very rarely speechless, and I remember I couldn't stop thinking about it for days. And I wished I could have had the right words, and I wish I could have done the right thing. But really, I think I was just in shock, and I was sad. And it also made me reflect on what I used to think, or rather not think of myself when I was living that way. I wasn't to the point that these people were saying, but, I had my first child at 17. It was in a high school relationship with my high school sweetheart. And it was never taught in our home that you don't do this before marriage. I didn't know who God was or
Right.
Who Jesus was and what he can do for you until I was 30. So I was far away from that. But I look at the heart of that girl. And even before, I had this boyfriend and we had this baby.
Yeah.
The heart that I was given by Christ, the heart he gave me when I entered into relationship with him, was so much more pure than that person was when she was deemed physically pure by the world. And I value that more than I ever would have valued my physical body. It's chasing after him and what he wants for me, what he's done for me, what he continues to do for me every single day, and the grace that he pours out on me is the only reason that I can look at someone and say, he wants more for you than this, and what are we teaching our young men,
Right.
to stand up and be leaders and to say to these women, I value you so much because you are a creation of God and because you are loved by the same Jesus that loves me, that I'm not going to lead you down a path that I'm not going to walk with you until the end of time.
Right.
We're going to save this for marriage because I want the best for you and I want the best for me.
Absolutely.
And I see so much in the world, in churches, where it becomes the woman's responsibility.
Absolutely.
To be pure. A friend of mine was actually sharing that at a private high school close to where she lives, that her kids no longer go to, a private Christian school, that the girls have to bring in their prom dresses to be approved. And I'm thinking, on the one hand, I can understand where the school's coming from.
Yeah.
They think they're doing a great thing. What is that telling the girls?
Right.
And what is it telling the boys?
Right.
That purity and stumbling blocks are solely the female's responsibility.
Yeah.
We have a part of it, but it's not solely rested on our shoulders.
Yeah.
You know,
it's a dangerous place to be in. And I think a lot of the
Super.
times, like even thinking back to like high school and college relationships, I remember one of the guys that I was talking to, it was, I respect that you don't want to have sex before marriage, but it was never a, oh, I believe the same thing.
Right.
But it was a, I respect you and I'm going to respect that. And it's like, that's a red flag. Like,
That's wise. That's smart. I'd never thought of it that way, but that's very wise.
because if you're not holding to your own convictions, there's nothing tethering you to that stronghold.
Right.
There's no internal motivation to adhere to it.
Yeah.
And that was the sticky situation I got myself into. It was like, okay, well, if he says he's going to respect that, he's going to respect that. And
Right.
it's
I found the perfect guy.
right. It's like, oh, that's awesome. Because not very many people say that anymore. But
right.
it was, I'm going to respect your decision. I'm not going to make that my decision. And to any woman listening, like that is a red flag. Like that's, you need to find somebody who is, for lack of better words,
It
equally
beats you
yoked.
to the punch.
Yeah.
That says it before you can even say it.
Absolutely. And then chase after God together.
Yes,
Like,
that's
if
right.
you're not finding someone who's running as fast as you haven't found the one.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have to stop and slow down for somebody in your walk with Christ. You should be able to, as you're running, find somebody who's running alongside with you.
And like almost want to outdo one another.
Absolutely. Because it makes you better.
Absolutely.
It's a challenge. It should be
Yeah.
an everyday challenge of, hey, today, how can we be better?
I felt closer to Jesus today because I spent time with this individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he makes
and-
me want to be better.
And what a
Right.
great thing to strive for. I mean, and that brings me to the other part of this conversation is, okay, then you get married. Well, what happened to all the years of trying to mentor somebody and build them up to have a successful marriage?
Yeah.
It's like, is the success just the physical? Because that's a very small part of your relationship. It's not the entirety of it. And if it is, that's a problem.
Right. Absolutely it is.
But how am I going to shower my spouse with grace? I'm sure my husband's going to listen to this and laugh. He'll be like, how do you? But how do I daily shower my spouse with grace? How do I show forgiveness? Somebody very wise said that marriage is the single greatest act of sanctification that Jesus can call somebody into, because it's a moment by moment continual call to offer grace to somebody.
It is. And it's hard. It's not always easy.
It's hard. And you should have that becoming one in flesh together, to becoming one person. You should have that as the balm that soothes you. It shouldn't be this thing that you had all of these negative thoughts about up until the marriage, and now all of a sudden you're supposed to see it for the wonderful gift that it is. You can't just turn that on and off quickly.
No.
And I think too, something that I hear from a lot of young women, that working in the line of work that I did for so long, sex is just a part of the conversation every day. You know, I worked in a pregnancy center. It's how we all got here.
Right.
So sex was a part of every conversation. But so much that I would hear from girls who they would always use the same term. I did all the right things. And then my marriage failed. And now they no longer feel they need to chase after purity, because it's always been sold as a physical thing only. It's not their heart. It's not their mind. And one of the things we believed so much in talking with these women was, we're going to see them here every single year after year, with a new pregnancy, with a new boyfriend, until we get to the root of this. And the root of it is our heart.
Yeah, it is.
And it's that relationship with Christ. And that's the only thing that's going to get us more pure.
Right.
I know you have some scripture you want to share, and I want to give you the opportunity to do that, because I loved them.
Yeah.
But just breaking down in the Bible all the areas it calls us to be pure that have nothing to do with our bodies.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it is. I mean, we talk Matthew 5:8. It's blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Or, we talked about Proverbs 4:23 a little bit. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. If everything that you do is flowing from your heart, and your heart isn't pure, then what are you living out of?
Right.
We're called to live in the overflow of our life. And so like if our cup is full, what is it full of? What is spilling out into the rest of your life? What's spilling out into your relationships?
Yeah.
What's spilling out into your marriage? What's spilling out into your friendships? What's spilling out to your coworkers? Like that's where we are a witness and a disciple for the Lord Jesus Christ is in our life. Like your life is your ministry, regardless of whether you're in a position at a church or not. You are called to do ministry. It's the Great Commission, right? And so like if we are called to be pure in heart, that does not just mean, okay, I'm going to wait for marriage. Like if that's all you think purity is, we need to have a deeper conversation.
Right.
Being pure in heart is daily concentrating on, okay, God, you are the top priority in my life. How can I serve you better? How can I reflect you better?
Right.
How can I take on your characteristics and love others around me? And it's difficult to shift that narrative because it was pushed so heavy. I think we're doing a little bit better now in the upcoming generations, but when I was in youth group, it was that narrative that was pushed. It was purity it equates to physical intimacy.
And, if I'm being honest with you, if I just look back over the years, from the sexual revolution on forward, the generation I grew up in was, in America, we had the highest rates of teen pregnancy that this country's ever seen.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that was birthed from the fear that we need to take the pendulum and swing it in the entirely opposite direction in order to get a handle on this thing. Yeah. And so I think that churches stepped up into that need, which was great. And I don't want to bash the churches at all. I just think that it has to be an all-encompassing concept and not just one part of the whole that Jesus cares for.
Absolutely.
He wants, in order for me to be the best mother I can be, my sexual relationship with my husband has nothing to do with that.
Right.
But the purity of my heart, the purity of my words, edifying my children, being pure in speaking and thought, all of that is going to make me into a mother who is more closely modeling Jesus to my kids. Yeah. And when we look back at the end of our lives, and if we have the opportunity to be on a deathbed surrounded by our loved ones, there might be one person in the room with someone we had a sexual relationship with. Think of all the other important relationships in our lives that have nothing to do with sex. It has to do with how you were treated by them and how you treated them and how richly they blessed your life and what you went through together. And we've put such an emphasis that when people are coming into the church having not lived that pure life, they automatically feel, and even though the church is most times not doing this, they automatically feel the church is making me feel shame.
Right.
And isn't it so like the devil to walk us into a situation and then to beat us over the head while we're in it?
Right. Well, because if you feel that shame, then you're not going to want to walk out the Christian lifestyle or come back to church on a Sunday.
Yeah, it keeps you in a cycle.
I've heard from couples too who are living together or are engaging in sexual activity before marriage, and it's like we feel judged, and it's like, well, is it that you're feeling judged, or are you being convicted? And I think we've gotten so soft, even as Christians in this society, that when we feel a conviction, it's not okay. Right. Like I feel judgment.
Blame
I feel
somebody
shame.
else.
Right.
Yeah.
We're going to shift the blame to something else. Well, I'm going to blame somebody else because I feel judged now. And it's like, no, you're being convicted by the Holy Spirit, and that's a good thing. What is he calling you to do from there? I think too, like we talk about purity and we talk about saving ourselves for marriage. Okay, well, what does that look like? I think sometimes we don't do a great job of breaking that down, even outside of just, okay, that's just a heart thing too. Like, when we're talking about purity, it's a heart thing, but what can we break down from saving ourselves from marriage? How does that break down? Because I've had a lot of people over the years ask me, okay, well, like how far is too far? And I have to chuckle at that question because it's a very, very dangerous
the question is too far.
slope. The question is too far. And so usually my first response is, okay, well, if you're asking me that question,
we should talk.
Yeah.
You've
already gone too far. Because when we're talking about purity, we're talking about thoughts. And so, okay, if we're lusting after somebody, the scriptures say, if you're looking lustfully at a woman in your eyes, like you've already committed adultery with her.
Committed it. That's right.
And so it's like, okay, well, if we're going to back up from there, then everything from your thoughts to the way you're thinking, what you feel in your heart, that's a part of your purity. Right. And so when we're talking about it, saving yourself from marriage, if we're looking at the scope of not just the physical, but also the emotional ties that come with it, anything that leads up to the act of sex, like that's impure.
Right.
And it's such a hard, and once you've opened that door, it's hard to close it.
Yes, it is.
speaking from somebody who has been there, it is very hard to close that door. Reset boundaries. It's incredibly difficult to walk past the boundaries blatantly and then say, oh crap, I got to get back.
Right.
How do I climb up this cliff? And 1 Corinthians 6:18 says this. It says, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body.
Right.
And so we're talking about shame. We're talking about guilt. And I can remember in that season, like the amount of shame and guilt I had for even just a little bit that I did, I couldn't imagine.
Right. And it probably did not bring you to your knees in prayer.
No, it brought me away from the church.
That's right.
I went through a season of, I would say, depression. It got to the point where my dad looked at me and sat me down. He said, I don't recognize you and I don't see the spirit in you. And it was like, oh, like I've cast myself away from the church because of something I did, because the devil is allowed to speak into my life. Because of what you've done, you're condemned.
Right.
It's like, you're not.
God doesn't want you anymore.
No, right.
And he's very good at saying that. Yeah.
He is very good at saying that. And so it took me finding people that I could be vulnerable with in my darkest moments that brought me back out of that. And so it's very important to, you talked about the Heart of the Matter series that you discussed with Pastor Aaron on a previous podcast episode. And in one of the statements he made on that podcast episode, he was talking about the guardrails.
Yeah.
The guardrails that we set in our life.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time with purity, we're setting the guardrails right before sex. When that's not where it needs to be. If we're talking about a guardrail being a buffer between the actual act and we need to be setting it way sooner than that.
Right.
We need to be buffering our thoughts. We need to be buffering what we're allowing ourselves to be in close contact with anybody.
Right. What we're watching.
It is.
We're facing a huge issue in younger boys of pornography addictions.
Oh yeah.
You know, just looking at what that does to a male's brain from a chemical perspective. Well, it's no wonder it seems impossible for them to stop.
Yeah.
Their brain has become accustomed to how it feels when
it's
that
an
happens.
addiction.
And so you might say, well, I've never had sex with a girl, but you've achieved the same outcome by someone you don't even know.
Yes.
And I think it's a tricky situation because if you catch your child watching pornography that they've probably been shown on the back of a bus.
Yeah.
If that's the first conversation you're having with them about sex, you've let it go too far.
Right.
It doesn't mean you can't work your way back. It just means it's going to be very,
Right.
very difficult to do that.
Right. And that would be my encouragement to any parent is like, it is happening earlier and earlier just because there's a curiosity of the human brain, right?
Sure.
So if we're shown things like whether it be a TV show, whether it be a movie or whether it be a book, there's a lot of books out there that are pushing the agenda as well of smut, just absolute smut.
Yeah.
And it's being like paraded around. Like
There's
it's this
books
awesome
that are
thing.
put in the Christian section that are like
Yes.
romance books.
It's like, oh my goodness.
But yeah, it's like
Still introducing that concept.
That's right. And awakening the heart. You know, the Bible talks about not awaking love before it's time.
Yes. Because Paul
is
says
why.
it's better to be single or to get married. Like,
That's right.
You are either living in one of those two camps.
That's
Otherwise,
right.
it's a really, really difficult
Yeah,
battle.
and you're holy. The whole of you is serving God in that singleness, right?
Yes.
It's you have not been made one flesh with somebody else. You're still operating as your own. I think what I would say to, and obviously this is the start of what I hope to be many conversations. You know, as people kind of share feedback or ask questions, but one of the things that I found to be so loving was there's a speaker and an author named Lisa Bevere, and she wrote this incredible book that I had stumbled upon very early in my walk with Christ, and it was called Kissed the Girls and Made Them Cry. And she's very honest and open in this book about how she was not raised in a Christian home. Her husband was. He had saved himself for marriage. She did not. She felt such shame having to admit to him that she was not a virgin. And she was sure that he was just going to not want to be with her. And that's what she believed. That's what the enemy had her believing about herself, even though she had now found God and he had brought her this amazing Christian man who she's still married to this day. But she felt so much shame that she was like, well, of course he'd leave me. Why wouldn't he leave me? And he did the opposite. I mean, he showed her love. He showed her how to find, redemption from that and forgiveness for that. But she was then asked to teach a purity lesson to girls in her church when her boys were really young.
Yeah.
And she had like a meltdown preparing for this. And she was like, God, the pastor made a mistake. I have to tell him that I was not a virgin before marriage and I cannot teach this class. And so she reached out to the pastor and said, I think you've asked the wrong person because I didn't save myself for marriage. And he said, Lisa, that's exactly why I'm asking you to do this. And it was in that moment that she realized that God, he redeems all of it. I mean,
absolutely, he does.
casts our sin as far as the east is from the west, but beyond that, he makes us white as snow.
Yeah.
And it's not, I cast all of these sins away except for.
Right.
Or I make everything white as snow except for.
Right.
Or I am going to love you and have you spend eternity with me in heaven, but you're going to have to live in a different spot from everybody else with the sexually impure. It's all of it.
Yeah.
He has redeemed me as a human being for everything I've ever done. And that includes anything I had done that was considered sin, sexually or otherwise. But she was asked a question at the very end of this that was similar to what you said about how far is too far.
Yeah.
A girl wrote that, and that they could write these anonymous questions. And her response was, she said, the Holy Spirit gave me an answer in that moment. And the answer was, you can do whatever you'd feel comfortable doing if your father was with you.
Ooh, that's good.
And then she said that all the girls were like,
Like, I would never do that in front of my dad. Like,
yeah. And she's
you're going
like,
too far.
your father is with you.
Exactly.
Your heavenly father is there with
Always
you.
present.
He's always present with you. And it's not about, well, I want to sneak and do this.
Right.
He saw it all. He saw it all. And I think that was actually very, very encouraging for me as a believer, was that I didn't have to go to him with these secrets.
Yeah.
If I believed him to be the creator of the universe, he already knew. If the wind and the waves obey his very command, then he already knew what I was doing.
Yeah.
Everything that is done in the dark is brought into the light.
Absolutely it is.
And it was in the bringing all this stuff to the light that I found freedom. So now there's nothing that anybody can say to me or about me that is in contradiction to what Jesus has said about me. And that's that I belong to him.
Right.
And he knows everything I did before,
Yeah.
you know? But I think we just need to be more encouraging in the church to say, we by no means are suggesting that you go and live a sexually impure life because we don't think purity matters physically. We believe it matters so much, but we believe it's all encompassing.
Right.
We believe it is, of the heart of the mind. There's a couple scriptures I was going to share, as a close, but this morning I was lucky enough to see a short little study, and in Psalms 103, it said, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. He who forgives all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from destruction, and who crowns you with loving kindness, tender mercies, who satisfies your mouth with good things." Another illustration of that was pure things. So that your youth is renewed like the eagles. The Lord executes righteousness and justice for all who are oppressed. And I'm like, all. That's all of us.
It's very inclusive.
Yes, it is, because living an impure life was oppressive.
Yeah.
Chasing after purity with God as my guide is freedom.
Right.
You've already talked about Matthew 5. Philippians 4 we touched on a little bit, but really ruminating on whatever things are true, whatever's noble, whatever's just, and whatever's pure.
Yeah.
And that those things are lovely.
Yeah.
And to anyone who's listening to this thinking, well, you don't know what I've done. I don't, but he does.
Yes.
And he loves you anyway.
Yeah.
And he might want to take you through a healing process of that so that you can get to a place of fully understanding and accepting what forgiveness is.
Yes.
In our abortion recovery classes, we spend 2 whole chapters on that. It's first understanding the idea of forgiveness and then getting to a place where you accept it.
Right.
Because it's a big concept in our human minds to fully understand and fathom what his forgiveness means. And it means all
of it.
All. So, let this be an encouragement to all of us, whether you're female or not, whether you have daughters or not, whether you're married or you're single, is let us wake up every day and say, what is the pure thing you want me to do today, Lord?
Yeah.
How can I love someone like you in your pureness, in your goodness, in all that you are? Show me how to be more like you. Yeah. And I think the conversations will start to change a little bit for the better.
Yeah, I think so too. I think if we can focus on purity, the rest follows, right?
That's right.
If we're focusing on our love with Christ and pursuing his character, I think the rest naturally happens.
Yeah, it does.
The closer
you don't have
we
to
are,
fight it.
Right. The closer we are to Jesus Christ and in our relationship with him, like the less we're going to desire things of this world.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you for being here. I can't wait to have you on again. I'll find something for us to talk about. Thank you guys for listening. And as always, we appreciate your support, and we'll catch you next time.